Hello and welcome to a new video. The Intermezzo Championship games have not finished, so I can't show you one of those games yet, but in the meantime we can do a video that was voted for by my Patreon supporters and is basically a continuation of a video that I did some months ago where I talked about the H1 events, and today we will continue that and I will do a talk about the H2 events. I will go through all of the events, share my thoughts about them. I will not go through the colonies, though those might be handled in an additional video at some point, but I will go through all of the other events, just share my thoughts about them. What do you need to consider when you think about playing them? How can you maybe prepare for them? What events do you maybe really need to have in mind when you don't have knowledge about them and they could be in the deck? I will just share some thoughts. Some of those thoughts maybe are not really that new for the more advanced and expert players among you, but I hope that maybe some of the things that I will say could still be interesting for those players as well, and for maybe some of the viewers who are just starting to play the game or are not that experienced yet. I hope that maybe a lot of the things that I will say can maybe be interesting and helpful when playing the game. Alright, first I will start by talking about the strength events, and then I will continue with the happy face related events, then with the events that you need to have in mind when thinking about declaring war or not: economic progress, freedom of movement, and arms industry. And then after that I will just continue with all of the remaining events. Alright, and let's start with the strength events, and we have 7 of them, I think: Crime Wave, Independence Declaration, Cold War, Refugees, International Agreement, Politics of Strength, and International Negotiations. So 7 events out of, I think, a total of 25, if I remember it correctly. So not a lot, but definitely some, and I think some of those could definitely can also be quite swingy and quite impactful. So the H2 strength events definitely have the potential to be quite game deciding and can have quite an impact in the game. But the first strength events that we can maybe talk about is one that most of the times doesn't have a big impact in the game, and that is the crime wave, where the weakest, or in 3 and 4 player games, the 2 weakest players will lose 3 culture and a blue token. And that is one of the events that you can often relatively safely see it if you are in a position where you think that you could get some benefits out of seeding now. Maybe you have knowledge about an event in the deck that you want to see revealed now, or maybe you are for the moment are the strongest and just want to have a shot at winning a strength events. Then most of the times you can just seed a crime wave, and even if you at the end should get hit by it, it's not the biggest swing and it's not too bad at the end. So relatively safe event to seed. Nonetheless, if you expect that there are got some good chances that you will be among the players who will get hit by the event, then if you don't have any specific reason to seed, it can still be better to hold back. Of course, having knowledge about the event deck can be an advantage already in itself. So even when you don't see a specific reason to seed, it can still be fine to seed. But despite maybe then missing out on the 2 culture that you get for seeding, it can then of course also be fine to hold back of the event. You lose 3 culture and a blue token. Losing 1 blue token is maybe not that impactful most of the times, but also should not be completely underestimated. And when seeding it, you also have to have in mind how maybe the general blue token situation is, especially if you or maybe one of the other players has already a little bit of a blue token shortage. Maybe a player has 1 or 2 vast territories, or maybe even the autonomous territory, or one player has the Louvre built or under construction. So if it looks like one player has a blue token shortage, that definitely has to be taken into account, because if you are already missing some blue tokens, then losing another one can actually be quite impactful and can make it really difficult to get out of corruption again. So if you are the player who has already lost some blue tokens, maybe you should be a bit more careful than usual with seeding this event. On the other hand, if you maybe have some additional blue tokens while one of your opponents is low on blue tokens, then maybe that can actually be a potentially damaging event, which can be worthwhile playing around and maybe worthwhile trying to get stronger for. So an event that most of the times can safely be seeded, but the blue token not that impactful, but still you have to have it in mind and be a bit careful if you are maybe missing some blue tokens already. Then the next event that we have is the Independence Declaration, which can be very swingy. Sometimes we'll just do nothing, a player will get hit by it who doesn't have a colony and nothing will be lost. And sometimes a player has to lose a vast territory too and will lose 4 yellow tokens, which is an extremely big thing to lose. Or maybe an autonomous territory losing a civil and a military action for the rest of the game. So when seeding that one, of course, you have to see what colonies do the other players already have. And especially if a player has only a very strong colony, then it can be very worthwhile seeding it into the deck and trying to somehow make it that maybe that player will get hit by the event, as it can then be very impactful. Ideally, you see this event maybe if you don't have a colony for yourself, or if you have maybe a colony that is not that bad to lose. For example, if we go to the H1 events, the wealthy territory, of course, having the 3 additional blue tokens can be nice, can make you more flexible, but if that event is revealed maybe in H3, at the beginning of H3 or something, then losing 3 blue tokens is maybe not too bad, or losing maybe 1 happy face, 2 strength, those things can already hurt. So if you expect to be weakest and you have one of those colonies, you still have to ask yourself whether you want to see the Independence Declaration. But if there's maybe a chance of another player having only a very strong colony lying around, then I think it can be worthwhile seeding it. And of course, the best case for you is if you just yourself have no colonies, then there's no danger for yourself in seeding it, at least unless of course you win a colony then in the time until it will be revealed, but it could potentially hurt some of your opponents. Also, of course, an interesting thing to have in mind is if there's a Suez Canal or James Cook in the game. Of course, if the player with the Suez Canal or James Cook loses a colony, it is even more hurtful than usual, especially with the Suez Canal. If a colony is lost relatively early for that, and that definitely will cost some resources until the end of the game. And now, generally about the H2 events, as you need to draw them and then seed them, and then first the H1 events that are still remaining in the event deck have to be revealed. I think the H2 events are most of the times revealed the earliest in the middle of H2, unless there's some crazy seeding going on, and then most of them maybe end of H2, beginning of H3. Also in H3, a lot of those events will be revealed. Alright, then the next strength event that we are having is also quite a potentially strong one. That is the Cold War, which will give the 2 strongest civilizations 6 additional signs. And yeah, first of all, we have to say that 6 additional signs is actually quite a big amount. For example, when you consider in H3, the revolutionary ideas are most of the times very highly contested, sometimes taken for 2 or even 3 civil actions. Then you also need another civil actions to play it. So getting just 6 signs from this event instead of having to invest that many civil actions into it can be quite beneficial. And when seeding that, you not only have to have in mind how likely it is for you to be the strongest or one of the 2 strongest in 3 and 4 player games, but also how is the general science situation. Which players need the science, how urgently. If you are swimming already in science, if you are swimming in science already, and even if you have maybe a good shot at being one of the 2 strongest, maybe you shouldn't seed it because the 6 science is maybe not that useful for yourself, and especially in a 3 and a 4 player game, one other player will also get 6 science and might profit from it. It can still be fine to seed it if you think you have very good chances of being the strongest, but if you have a lot of science and it's a bit unclear whether you will be strongest or not, then definitely be very careful with putting that into the deck, especially if one of your opponents has very low science, and getting 6 additional science would just be maybe exactly that what he needs to come back in the game and have a very strong H3. So maybe even more or equally so. You have to equally consider how likely is it that you will be part of the event, but also how much does each player need the science. Of course, if you are low in science and have a chance to win that one, that can be really, really big and can be an extremely helpful and powerful event. Getting 6 science in that situation can just really be game-breaking potentially. So a very strong event that definitely is worth fighting for, and especially in a 2-player game. There especially you have to be very careful about how much the science could potentially be of use for your one opponent, because giving 6 science for your opponent when he actually needs that science can just be completely bad. So there you have to be especially careful. Yeah, so the Cold War, potentially very strong event. 6 science, definitely an amount of value that yeah, is quite a lot and can really boost your position in H3 when maybe you want to develop some expensive technologies, or maybe get into an H3 government form, which will take a lot of science. And if thanks to the Cold War you can maybe get into one of those things quicker, then it can still really start snowballing again, even though we are already at a late stage of the game. Even then, that can really lead to potentially some snowballing effects. Then the next strength event that we are having are the refugees, and the refugees could be considered as maybe the strongest strength event in the sense of what it gives to the player, or the overall value that is created for the player who wins it, especially of course in a 2-player game where you are the player who win it and the one opponent is the player who will lose to the event. That being said, some of the other strength events can also can be extremely swingy. We will talk about that with the next event after the refugees, but the overall value that will just be generated with that might potentially be the strongest. Of course, politics of strength also being a contender. But now, gaining a population and 3 culture, and one other player losing a population and losing 3 culture is just a lot of value. If we go back to H1, of course, generally the events in H2, at least partly, maybe are supposed to create a little bit more value than those from H1, but nonetheless, Reign of Terror is an event that can be quite bad in H1, where just the weakest player, loses a population, and here the weakest player loses a population but also 3 culture, and if you should win it, then you gain a population and you gain 3 culture. So basically a combination of Reign of Terror, Immigration if you win it for yourself, and Crusades just with 3 instead of 4 culture. So an extremely big amount of value, and with that being such a strong event, you have to be very careful when seeding that. Events like Ram Wave, or maybe at some points Independence Declaration, you can push into the deck a bit more lightly. The refugees, you really need to have a plan on whether you will be strongest at a point when it will be revealed, and it is an event that can be worth fighting for, maybe not seeding, getting stronger again, and trying to make sure that you win that event and get the value, especially in a 2-player game, where it would mean that if you don't win the event, you would actually be on the losing side of the event. If maybe in a 4-player game you seed it and at the end you are not part of that, maybe it's fine, it's a somewhat neutral event. So you can maybe seed it a bit more lightly if you at least think that you are not the weakest. But in a 2-player game, you really need to make sure that you win it at the end. And also, of course, in a 3- and 4-player game, it can be an event that is definitely worth fighting for. Of course, another thing to consider is how much do you need population, how much do your opponents need population. If you are low in population, then the events gets even more swingy. If you should lose it, it would be devastating. If you should win it, it could be a really, really big help for you. So then you maybe need to be even more sure on whether you will win it or not. If you have already a lot of population, then at least for yourself, it's maybe you can see that a bit more lightly, because if you should get hit by it, at least the loss of the population is not as bad as maybe it could be in other situations. The next event is also a very interesting one, the International Agreement, which allows a player to use 5 civil actions to take cards from the row, but at the cost of 1 politics action. And for that event, I have to say, over maybe the last 1 or 2 years, I have become a lot more careful with putting that one into the deck. At times, when I started playing the game, and also maybe in the first 1, 2, 3 years, I don't know exactly how long, I just sometimes seeded that into the deck, because often, or maybe not often, but sometimes it will happen that a player will win this event, but the cost of sacrificing a politics action to take those cards is just too big. Maybe a war needs to be declared, an aggression to be played, a good impact seeded, and not a lot of politics actions are left. And sometimes if you maybe seed it and open it at your turn, then you have to already consider the politics action of the next turn, and making it certain that you won't be able to use that can have some implications. The other players know that they are safe from a war for a whole turn, can't get hit by an aggression, and you don't know what events you maybe draw that you want to put in the deck. So sometimes it won't just be used, and maybe it happens on a very regular basis, so I just seed it into the deck thinking, oh, sometimes it's just not really doing anything. But I just now too often have seen this put to extremely good use, having seen players getting some really big value out of it that probably exceeds the value of all of the other strength events by potentially quite a lot. Sometimes the politics action is not that worthwhile. Maybe sometimes it wouldn't be used at all, or sometimes it's just not that worthwhile. Maybe you would just put in a somewhat neutral event instead. But then having the opportunity, if you have free hand, to just take maybe 3, 4 yellow cards, that already can be a lot of value. If you maybe take reserves, an urban growth, a revolutionary idea, the amount of value and resources science that you get out of those cards for basically free. I mean, a card like revolutionary idea or reserves, you of course have to invest further civil actions in to play them, but still that is a lot of value. And sometimes it can just be completely crazy, maybe allowing something that otherwise wouldn't be possible in the slightest. Maybe you are in a difficult spot where you can take a wonder, or you need to prepare for war, but you also would like to take that wonder, and out of the sudden you can do both with the international agreement, and it's just completely game breaking. Or maybe you can take, when it's still revealed at the end of Age 2 or something, maybe you can take a strong wonder, something like Ocean Liner Service, and then finish it immediately. So it can have its very strong moments. Of course, you can try to have a little bit of a tell on whether that one will be so impactful or not. Thinking about how are the players positioning themselves. Maybe a player is investing a lot into the military, in which case it more often is maybe a bit more costly to sacrifice a politics action. So then maybe you can consider that, or hope that maybe that won't be used. And of course, what is needed to make really good use out of it, unless you maybe use it to take a wonder. But if you can't take a wonder, then you need a lot of free hand space, and in order to have a lot of free hand space, a lot of civil actions. So if some of your opponents have a lot of civil actions, and it's not certain whether you will be the strongest or not, I would be very, very careful with seeding that, because when they have enough hand space to just take 3 or 4 cards, that can just be extremely big, getting 5 additional civil actions and being able to put them to somewhat good use. And if the players don't have that many civil actions for now, if you maybe think it will be revealed relatively soon, so that fact won't change in the near future, then of course, especially if they maybe have some backup cards in hand or something, you can maybe hope that the impact won't be too big and seed it even when not really knowing whether you actually will be the strongest or not. So that can give you a little bit of a tell. And now, so an event that I think you shouldn't see too lightly into the deck. Sometimes I hear players say, oh, that doesn't really do a lot, and sometimes it will just do nothing. I can just seed it into the deck, but it can also be generating a lot of value, and I think especially on a high level, I see this accepted relatively often just because of the amount of things that you can get out of, and maybe also because on a high level, maybe the players potentially build stronger civilizations unless they disrupt themselves all the time, and maybe have then the necessary civil actions to take some cards. Also, one last thing to have in mind when thinking about the international agreement is, of course, that that event can also accelerate the game. If some additional cards are taken, that can definitely end in making the game a turn shorter. So also another thing that you need to consider: do you have a position, maybe a strong economical one, where you haven't really started your culture engine yet, where you are maybe really profiting from having an additional turn in the game to maybe get another impact and make the wonders stronger that you are building at the end, have another big turn of production after having built some culture production finally, then maybe you should be a bit more careful if maybe your goal is to accelerate the game because you maybe went for an early culture strategy and you would profit from the game being a bit shorter so that you don't get punished for your potentially weaker economy, then maybe you can just put it into the deck, even with the danger that one of your opponents wins it, because even if one of your opponents wins it, maybe at least the game will be accelerated. And yeah, so and also in your consideration, then if you are approaching the end of the age, that can sometimes change your math. I remember one specific situation where the end of age 2 was approaching, but I knew that my opponent can't really end the age. And with that, I left myself. I had Barbarossa and I saved up some food and I planned to do, I think, 2 or 3 Barbarossa activations at the next turn. And then I wanted to switch to Bach and develop the drama that I had in hand. The operas were already gone. And then, after I ended my turn, the international agreement was revealed. A bunch of cards were taken. Out of the sudden, I realized, oh my, now this was a 3-player game. Now the other player who plays in front of me can just end the game. I won't get the Barbarossa activations. I will lose the civil action for replacing my leader. And I don't have a drama any longer for Bach, which I was really banking on. And I was really thinking, oh my, that might just ruin my game. But it was a game against not so experienced players, and then the player in front of me didn't end the age, which I think should have been definitely worth it. So I got a bit lucky, but just an example of how that event can also just change the math on whether it's possible for the age to end before your next turn or not. Alright, then the next strength event that we are having is the Politics of Strength, giving the player who wins it 5 additional draws, and the other player who loses it has to skip the draw step. And if it is revealed in age 4, instead 5 culture will be gained, 3 culture be lost. That can also be a very impactful event, and together with refugees, definitely an event that you should only push into the deck when you think you have good chances being the strongest. Sometimes you can avoid that losing to the event is bad for you, because maybe you have a turn planned where you would use all of your military actions anyway, and if you then get hit by the refugees, it's not really bad for you, but it would still always very strong for one player who gets 5 additional draws. In age 2, those draws can be really strong already, if you maybe are still needing a tactic or something, but especially in age 3, where it's really important to draw the right impacts that are fitting your civilization. 5 additional draws can, if those 5 draws just gives you 2 additional impacts that are playable, that already is a lot of culture. But this event is maybe the most impactful, the most strongest, and the event that you are maybe really hoping towards getting when you are trying to go for a military game. Because if you are really, let's say, almost going all in into military, then of course the real bottleneck and thing that you don't have control over is whether you will at the end actually get a war in age 3 or not. You can make sure to draw 3 cards every turn, and then you will have a good shot at least getting 1 war at some point. But if you have access to the Politics of Strength, then it is just such a strong event to push in such a situation, often even more important than basically all of the other strength events, because 5 additional draws will make it a lot more likely that you get 1 war, and of course also increase the chance quite a bit that maybe you get 2 wars, also increase the chance quite a bit that maybe you get access to a strong H3 tactic, which can give you an even higher strength potential. So if you are going for a military game and your plan is to maybe win the game by going for some wars in H3, then this event is of course the event that you're looking forward, or that you are, yeah, that's just most important to you. And if you have the chance, or if you're lucky to draw it, you should definitely put it into the deck and make sure that it is revealed very quickly. And yeah, so it also draws definitely quite strong potentially. Of course, one thing to consider how strong this event can be for a player who wins it is also how many of those cards can such a player keep in hand. If a player has only 2 or 3 military actions, then those additional draws can still be very helpful, especially because this player in general will maybe not get that many draws with being that low in military actions. But with not being able to hold that many cards in hand, it definitely can be a bit weaker, because if you have a lot of military actions and you get those draws, you can maybe keep a war, you can keep some colonization cards. If there's a colony coming, you can keep 1 or 2 impacts, also maybe some different impacts depending on in which direction you want the game to go. But if you have only 2 or 3 military actions, then you have to commit already to a specific direction sometimes when you decide about which cards you want to discard. Also, one interesting thing that for a long time I didn't know, but if this event is revealed in H3, at the end of H3, then of course the player who wins it will get 5 draws immediately according to the digital rules. But if then the player who would miss out on the draw step has his next turn in H4, then of course he wouldn't have a draw step and then he would lose the 3 culture at the end of his turn. Because I had one game where a viewer noticed that for some reason one player just lost 3 culture at the end of the turn, and the question was why does the player lose 3 culture, and it was because of a politics of strength being revealed earlier while it was still H3. Normally when it is revealed in H4 the culture will just be lost immediately, but if it is revealed in H3 and then the player who would miss out on the draw step is in H4, then that culture will be lost at the end of this turn of the player. Alright, now we will go to the last one of the strength events and the one that was introduced with the expansion, because I think the events that are here at the end and also the one here at the end are the events from the expansion. And it's the international negotiations. An event that definitely can also be quite swingy, but also maybe not an event that you can count on too much, because it depends a lot on when it will be revealed, on what value it will actually give to you. If you have seeded it and you will be able to win it, it will be very strong, of course, if it is revealed on your turn and you can decide what of those 3 things, resources, food or science, you can take from the weakest opponent. And if it is revealed on the weakest opponent's turn, and of course the opponent will give you probably something that isn't really helping you that much. So yeah, an event that maybe you can't really plan towards too much. An event that you still sometimes have to have in mind, because it's actually the only way from H2 events at least how you can lose some resources directly. Just not losing production or anything, but just losing the amount of resource that you have stored up, apart from an economic progress where you have so much corruption that it is more than your production. Then you potentially can also actually lose a resource, but the international negotiations can cause you to lose some resource. So if the end of the game is approaching and there's still an H2 event and top and you are the weakest, then you have to be a bit careful, because if you leave yourself maybe with exactly enough resources to finish a wonder at your last turn, you could get hit by international negotiations. And if you don't have knowledge about that event, and at that point a lot of events will already be out, so if that is one of the few that are left, you have to have it in mind that you could potentially actually just lose some resources, and maybe it can be worthwhile creating a bit of a buffer so that you can still finish your wonder, even if you would get hit by the international negotiations and an opponent would decide to let you lose 3 resources. So that's of course very important to keep in mind. Then of course it's also always an interesting decision when you are the one to evaluate which player gets what out of this event if it is revealed on your turn. If you are not part of that event, then I think you have to decide about what category of resource will be transferred. You need to have 2 main things in mind. First of all, of course, you need to have in mind what does help the player who gets something out of that the least, and then what does hurt the player the most, which will which resource, when you will lose it, would hurt the player that is weakest the most. So those things you have to have in mind, but then you also in a 3 and 4 player game of course have to have in mind which of those players is at the moment competing with me more about the position that I'm aiming for. So ideally, of course, the first place, but if maybe the game hasn't been going and you think that the first place is out of reach, then maybe you for second or third place. So you need to think which of the players is at the moment a direct contender for the placement that I'm aiming towards, and then that should be the bigger factor to consider. So then you should hurt or help less that person that is competing with you. So that's also very important to take a look at, not only of in general what wants the one player and what helps him the least and what hurts the other player the most, but also then with weighing up, and because those things won't always match, of course. Just thinking about which is the direct contender for your placement. And of course, when you are the one to open it at your turn and you are part of it, either with losing or winning it, then I think it also depends a little bit. When you're on a 4-player game, you can just mainly consider what is best for you. Of course, also take a bit into account what the other player will get or lose. But in a 2-player game, it gets a lot more important, of course, as it is a zero sum in a 2-player game, that you need to consider the same as what is best or for yourself to what is worst for your opponent. So an event not easily to plan around, but can still have an impact, still important to have it in mind, and also an event that I wouldn't see it lightly if I am not sure whether I will be able to at least avoid weakest. If you think that you at least will be able to avoid weakest, you can push such an event. Also the same like maybe refugees. But if there is a risk that you will get hit by it, I would be a bit careful, because that can definitely end up being a bit of an annoying swing for you. Alright, with that we have covered all of the strength events, and we'll continue with the happy face related events, which we can maybe go through a bit more quicker. As I mean, the more main thing that you have to consider is, of course, at the point when it will be revealed, will I have unhappy faces or not? And if not, and if you maybe already have your happy faces very nicely covered, then it's just a very safe event to see it. And then, of course, how's the situation for your opponents? Is there a chance that it will even be a beneficial event for you, or will it most likely just be a neutral event that you have to consider when comparing it to other events that you maybe could potentially see it? So yeah, so not a lot more to say about them. Of course, when thinking about whether you will have happy faces or whether your opponents will have happy faces at a time when it will be revealed, it's important to have in mind, do those players already have a happy face solution in hand? How many happy face solutions are left in the deck? Is there a chance that I or maybe one of my opponents will miss out on a happy face solution? So that are just some things that you need to check. Nonetheless, those are of course not completely equal. And the civil unrest will just cause loss of culture, and which is worse, losing a population or maybe some culture, depends, of course, quite heavily on the situation. Of course, for immigration, you lose a population also only one when you have two unhappy faces. So if you have two unhappy faces, probably the civil unrest can sometimes hurt a bit more. 8 culture is definitely quite a bit, and only losing one population can sometimes be somewhat fine. So that depends on the situation, which one is potentially worse. I have the feeling that in age 3, when the end of the game is approaching, losing just some culture can be quite painful, and maybe even worse than losing a population, but it can just depend on the situation. Losing some culture is normally equally bad or good for the players. So with the civil unrest, you most of the times will just consider how likely it is that you have happy faces or not. The immigration, on the other hand, if you have a lot of population, maybe build an early ocean liner, and then you can maybe see that a bit more lightly, even when you at the moment don't know for certain if you will be able to fix your happy faces, but maybe there's a chance that one of the other players also will have some unhappy faces, then the population loss for the opponent might be a lot more worse than it is for you. And such things are normally not the case with the civil unrest. So with the immigration, you also have to, of course, need to take a look at the general situation on how the population income is fixed for all of the players. Then, of course, there are not only events that are punishing unhappy faces, but there's also one event, the prosperity, that is rewarding you to have a lot of happy faces, giving you 1 food per happy face that you have. And yeah, for that, maybe even more with than with the immigration, you of course need to have a look at how many happy faces will the players have. But most of the times there won't be very big differences. Maybe a player has 4, another one has 2. Sometimes, of course, there are very big differences. Maybe a player has built a St. Peter's Basilica and has already 7 or 8 happy faces. Then, of course, just the amount of happy faces will maybe make it that you don't want to see it if your opponent has it, or you just want to push it yourself if you are the one having that many happy faces. But maybe even more so for that event, you also need to consider how much does additional food help a specific player. If a specific player didn't find the time to fix the farms yet, even if you are the one who has more happy faces, I wouldn't see that event into the deck, because there's always a chance that maybe that player will get more happy faces until the time when it will be revealed, and then maybe the food will just be extremely more helpful for that one player. So for the prosperity, of course, you need to look at how many happy faces will the players have, but for that one, I think it's even more important to have a look at how useful will the additional food be for the players. And if a player is low in population, you shouldn't see that. If you are low in population, it can be a really strong event managing that. And if that just gives you one additional population, it can be so useful in such situations. So definitely an event that can help you maybe playing on a low food income game. So or in a low food income game, then that and maybe taking some reserves from the row and frugalities can really make it that you can manage to get some additional population out despite not really having any farm upgrades done. And then one last thing to consider is that there is one wonder in H3 where food is required, the red cross, and the prosperity can of course potentially help with that. If maybe you think that the Red Cross could be an interesting wonder for you, maybe you have a lot of civil actions or something like architecture, there's a chance that you could just take and finish it, but saving up 15 or more food is always difficult. But if you seed it and know it will at some point be revealed, there's always a chance that maybe you're a bit lucky, it will be revealed at the right time, you will get some additional food, and maybe it will help you finishing the Red Cross, especially if the other players are not looking like they can easily finish the Red Cross. Maybe they have already built a lot of wonders, maybe they have already a wonder from H3 under construction. So the Red Cross, if you nicely time that and think that you have good chances of getting the Red Cross while your opponent's not, then it's also an event that you can maybe just push, even if maybe the opponents get more food in total out of it. If you think that maybe the additional food can just help you just taking and finishing the Red Cross, which can be extremely powerful. Alright, with that we have covered happy face related events, and now we will continue with the events that maybe are important to have in mind when thinking about declaring a war or not, because if you are declaring war, then of course you need to figure out how much strength does the opponent that you want to declare war on can potentially reach. You need to think about different tactics that they could have, technology cards that maybe could be revealed, like strategy, or in H3 fundamentalism, military theory. So you need to consider a lot of things, and on top of that, you also need to consider what could be events that could be revealed. And at the time when thinking about the war declaration, most of the times H2 events will be on top. Sometimes, of course, H1 events can be on top, and you have to be wary about whether new deposits are still possible or not. But most of the times H2 events will be on top, and then the events to really look out for on how maybe a player could gain more resources, which then would help the player to build more stuff and get a higher strength potential. Those events are economic progress, freedom of movement, and to maybe a little bit of a lesser extent, but still important to have in mind, the arms industry. Those events can really help your opponent maybe building more strength, and you need to basically also do all of those. If you are playing on a high level and are maybe in a high stakes game, you also need to maybe at least make a quick calculation. What could a player do if there is a potential economic progress revealed out of the deck, if there would be a freedom of movement revealed, or if there is an arms industry. In addition to those, also some colonies like wealthy and autonomous territory can of course be helpful, potentially also strategic, or maybe the science of developed territory. So those are of course also cards that you have to have in mind, but of the events that I'm talking about today, those three are maybe the main ones. In specific situations, of course, events like iconoclasm, ravages of time, terrorism can also all be events that could potentially influence it, but most of the times you will look out on how is their way, how the player that I'm declaring war against can gain some additional resources or get something like freedom of movement, which would allow to build an additional unit maybe. So you need to make calculations for those, and with those events being important when you want to declare war, It's first of all, of course, nice to have knowledge about them. If you draw them at some point, it can be just nice. Even if you don't see them into the deck, you maybe later on know that those can't be in the deck, and it can be some useful knowledge. But of course, if your plan is maybe to go for a military heavy H3 and declare war at some point, you have to be very careful about seeding events like economic progress, freedom of movement, and maybe arms industry. Of course, if you think that those are revealed relatively quickly, you can maybe also use them for yourself to actually reach a higher strength potential and then after that go for a war. But if there's a chance that those can also take a bit longer until those will be revealed, you have to be careful about them about seeding them, because it can just be annoying if you end up being able to declare a war, but you know that an economic progress could be revealed that you seeded earlier on, which then will just be extremely helpful for the player who is defending the war. So if you are aiming towards a military heavy H3, be very careful about seeding those events into the deck. Then let's talk about them maybe a bit individually, and starting with the economic progress. And the economic progress is maybe, of course, you need to consider how much resource production do I have, how much food production do I have, and see that the combined value of those, which you will be getting out of the economic progress, ideally exceeds the value that your opponents are getting out of it. Very important for that one, as there is also corruption evaluated, is how many blue tokens do the players have, because sometimes you are maybe having some coal production, 9 resource production, and another player only iron production, but that event can still end up being beneficial for the player with the iron, because if that player has a lot of blue tokens and just gets 6 resources out of it, while you maybe only get 7 or only 5 out of it because you have some corruption, then that might end up being the more useful event for the player with the iron, especially because maybe the resources are more meaningful to him than those are for you, as you are already having some strong production. So the blue tokens are something that you have to have in mind, and also, of course, how useful are the resources for the players. If you have something strong that you can invest on, maybe you have something like journalisms in hand, which is a very strong building but also requires a lot of resources and some free populations, then even if you maybe are only getting the same or even a bit less out of it than your opponents, you can maybe seed it, because maybe the one opponent who gets more out of it is low in civil actions, has already a lot of resources stockpiled, and at the moment it's very unclear if that player will actually be able to use the resources nicely. It's not only just the mere amount of the resources that at the end the players will get out of it is important, but also, of course, how nicely those resources and the additional food can be put to good use. So a lot of things to have in mind to evaluate it correctly. It can be a very strong event when you are maybe late with fixing your resource production. Maybe your opponents are running on iron mines, have already produced a lot of resources, the coal upgrades, the coals are late, you get your upgrades down only in the end of H2, but if you then manage to get an economic progress revealed relatively quickly, then at least you will get an additional production, and your bigger production will just be extremely helpful for you, especially because when you have been playing with low resources before that, most of the times you're in a situation where you can still use a lot of additional rocks. So when you, of course, are the player who gets into coal, that can be a very potentially strong event. If you have something of course, like railroad, then that can be quite strong, because you have even bigger production. With the Suez Canal, it's a bit less so, or a lot depending on what colonies you have, but sometimes you have something like vast territory and maybe not a lot of additional blue tokens, and then especially if you're on bronze or iron mines, you can struggle a bit with corruption and not getting a lot out of the economic progress, especially if you're on bronze mines. You have a very big production number, but you don't have enough blue tokens sometimes to just get a lot of value out of the economic progress. Additional, when you are playing the ocean liner, the economic progress often is not the greatest event, because your food production most of the times will be low, and if you are only getting the resource out of it, then you really need to get some more resources out of it than your opponents to make up for the less food that you get out of it. So with the ocean liner service, normally I don't like it too much to seed that into the deck. And then for the economic progress, also something is the case that I mentioned in my H1 event talk. If you haven't watched that, you can maybe check it out. I talked about events like new deposits, scientific breakthrough, and that it can be beneficial to just keep them in hand. And in H2, maybe you see, okay, I can go into scientific method, I can get into coal, and then if you see them very late, out of the sudden they can give you a very nice boost. And economic progress can also be a nice event to keep in hand. If maybe you're in a position, for example, you have 2 scientific methods, iron mines, you have some good science production, a healthy amount of civil actions, and you know that if there's an early Bill Gates, you could get a really nice resource boost. Or if there's an early oil, thanks to your good science production, you also could get a very early resource boost. And in such a situation, it can be worthwhile maybe keeping the economic progress around and just then if those scenarios happen, you can maybe push it into the deck and and then get some very big value out of the economic progress, maybe with some oil mines or something. On the other hand, if you see that one of your opponents is nicely set up for some options in H3 that will increase the resource production, maybe it's just the end of H2, and at the moment the production is relatively equal, maybe even slightly beneficial for you, maybe you should still be a bit careful of seeding that, because it can still, especially if it takes some time until it will be revealed, the situation can change quite heavily and you have to be quite careful about it. The economic progress, of course, can also be quite impactful at the end of the game when players try to just get a resource together, prepare for impacts, finish a wonder, and then an economic progress can be quite helpful if you maybe have a wonder that gets potentially even bigger, something like Internet or Hollywood. Maybe it can be worthwhile keeping that event, pushing it, and if it is revealed in time, you can get just some additional resource, and if that allows you to finish the Hollywood and build an additional movie or something, then the resources can just give you a lot more than maybe your opponents would gain out of it. And sometimes, if you're playing in one of the later seeds, maybe in 3rd or 4th seed, you can also do a little bit of a trick, not only with the economic progress, also with some other events, but maybe the economic progress is one of the events, maybe together also with the freedom of movement, where that benefit can potentially be the strongest. Sometimes you could time the economic progress. It's not often possible, it's difficult to achieve, but sometimes you can time it that it will be revealed very, very late, and that it will be revealed after maybe player 1 or maybe also player 2 already had their last turns, meaning it will be revealed at a time where only you can benefit still out of the additional resources and food, while the others already had their last turn. It's of course a bit of a niche scenario, but a nice one to have in mind, because if you manage to achieve that, it can really be quite strong, as you gain a very nice amount of resources, maybe food, and the others are already done and can't use them any longer. Alright, but now enough talk about the economic progress. Let's switch to an event that is maybe even more difficult. Definitely a lot more difficult, so I could also probably talk a lot about this, but let's maybe try to not talk too much about just a single event, but still maybe dive into it. The freedom of movement can just be used in so many different ways. Being able to move a worker from somewhere into something new, paying the difference. It can just be so extremely useful. It can help you with building up some military. The access system of that event makes the attacker a bit more careful, maybe about some calculations about what strength can be reached. And maybe some obvious situations where the freedom of movement can be very strong for you, and if you see that you find yourself in a situation that is one of those, it is normally a relatively good seed. One thing that can be very nicely used, where it can be very nicely used for, is military transitions. If you are maybe on, let's say you're on fighting bands at the moment, you have a bunch of swordsmen, but you have drawn the fortifications tactic, you have already 1 or 2 cannons, but you have still those swordsmen lying around that are not doing that much, then the freedom of movement just allows you to put one of those swordsmen into the cannons, and at a low cost, without needing to disband it and build it new just for 2 resources, and it helps you really getting more of those fortifications tactics going. So For transitioning purposes into new tactics, the freedom of movement can just be very strong. If you at the moment still have some units that for the new tactic that you are maybe going for from H2 or maybe H3, some units are not necessary any longer, and you can use the freedom of movement to put those resources into unit type that is actually useful for the tactic. Then also, if you are going into something like journalism or multimedia and you still have some alchemies, the freedom of movement can be very nice. Maybe moving an alchemy into journalism for a relatively low price. You still get the science production, but on top you get some additional culture production. And if you maybe at the end get something like internet and Hollywood, that can of course be even bigger. Especially also for those wonders, if that event is revealed late, it can be extremely impactful. So yeah, when seeding it, most of the times you need just to have a look in some turns, how nicely will I be able to maybe transition something. And sometimes your opponents just have a civilization with, let's say, 2 selective breedings, 3 iron mines, 2 alchemies. They already have a tactic which they are fitting, where the units are fitting for very nicely. And in such situations, there is definitely the chance that maybe those opponents won't find a nice way to use it. But when you have something like journalism or can transition into new tactic, that can be very nice used. But even in situations where it isn't obvious now to use the freedom of movement to good use, I always encourage myself, and also of course you, when you play your own games, to be creative and think about ways, even when at the first look it looks like all of my workers are in the right place, still be creative and think about ways how it can be used nicely. Sometimes, of course, it will be the case you can't really do anything about it, and then you don't have to just because of feeling the need of using the event do something weird in order to use it. And of course, you sometimes have to pass on it, but it always feels a bit bad because it can be a potentially very strong event, and so try to be creative in one way. Which is probably also nothing new for the more experienced players, but can maybe be useful for newer players. One way how often the freedom of movement can be used. For example, during your turn, your idea is to build a 3rd alchemy. You just have the free population at the moment, and you play out your turn without using the freedom of movement, and you think, it would be a nice idea to build this additional alchemy. If you have more than 3 military actions, for example, you're in constitutional monarchy or 4 military actions, in such a situation it can just be then better, instead of building the alchemy during your turn, taking one of your military units, putting it into the 3rd alchemy with the freedom of movement, and instead of building the 3rd alchemy that you intended to build during the turn, you will then just rebuild that unit. And if you have more than 3 military actions, then it's not really costing you anything, apart from, of course, when you will use some other military actions during the turn. But sometimes you won't, and then you can just rebuild that unit. And instead of having used a civil action to spend the alchemy, you ended up using a military action to build that alchemy, and have maybe an additional civil action round to take an additional card, which can be quite strong. So that is certainly a way how oftentimes the freedom of movement can be used, even though you don't really intend to change how the population is divided. You just build a thing basically differently. And of course, sometimes it can also be done the other way around. If you're short on military actions, maybe you can get a unit without needing to use one and then rebuild something with a civil action, but most of the times it will be better the other way around. No, and you can just sometimes be very creative, think about just what are maybe things that you don't necessarily need. Maybe using it in a specific way can open up some new options. So be creative, try to find a use case. When the event is revealed, sometimes there are just so many possibilities and different turns that are just allowed because of it. So that can make turns very complicated. But if you find a good solution, it can be a very strong event. And ideally, maybe it can be used for transitioning purposes and moving workers to new urban building types, like maybe especially libraries, but also in the later game, maybe something like theaters. Alright, and then the last of those 3 events is the arms industry, which can just give some additional resources. When you see that one, of course, you need to have a look at the military technologies that a player have developed, but in addition to that, also what science production do they have? Have they already new military technologies in hand that they could develop soon? And if H3 is approaching and a player has a lot of science and could maybe still get some H3 military tech, so you have to be a bit more careful, even when maybe at the time you would get more out of it. You generally have to think about which player will use the resources more. If a player is still in bronze mines and gets 4, maybe even 6 resources out of that, it can be very, very impactful. If you have already strong resource production while the others are struggling a bit, maybe you'd rather keep this in hand, even if you maybe would get it equal or more resources out of it. So those are just some basic thoughts that you have about it, an event that you have to have in mind when you declare war and see if maybe a player could do something with additional resources being revealed. If you have a wonder like Colosseum, you can get more cheaply maybe military act tax out and take advantage of that. With Newton, you don't have to pay civil actions to develop something and can maybe prepare for something like arms industry, especially because when you are playing Newton, you normally also have a lot of science production. So, yeah, I mean, maybe not too much special about that event, just take a look at the military texts that are in play, that are in hand, the science situation, and which player can use actually the resources how much. Alright, and now we are through the events that I grouped a little bit, and now we will just go through the remaining ones, starting with the one on the left, and that is the Iconoclasm, which can be an extremely impactful event. The Iconoclasm probably is used most of the times to remove H2 leaders in H3. Sometimes it will remove H1 leaders in H2, and also it can of course remove H3 leaders in H4. And it's an event that can be very impactful, and I try, if I have enough hand space, to keep it in hand if I can, especially if either a player has already a leader that can, from H2, that can generate a lot of value for that player, then of course I definitely want to keep it. But also if maybe those players are still those leaders are still in the deck, and I know there is a leader like Bach, and some players are prepared for Bach, or some players have a lot of food production, and Maria Theresa is still in the deck, or there's a Newton or something, just some leaders that are generating a lot of value, then it can be worthwhile keeping that, because you don't know yet whether you will get one of your opponents. When you get them yourself, you just don't see the Iconoclasm. You know that you can keep that strong leader in play, or if your opponents gets the strong leaders, you kept the Iconoclasm, and you can seed it now and hope that it will be revealed in time. When seeding the Iconoclasm, it can sometimes be a bit of a tricky decision how you want to time it. Do you want to take some risks and seed it immediately so that there is a good chance that it will be revealed at the beginning of H3, but maybe also the danger that it will be revealed still in H2, so that it is out too early to remove one of the potential strong leaders from your opponents? And or do you want to play it more conservatively, wait a little bit until maybe the event tech has flipped one time, and then it will be revealed for certain, or almost for certain in H3, maybe even in H4, but most certain in H3, but there's just a chance that it will already be some turns in H3, and then the impact is not as big. I personally often tend to be willing to take a bit more risks, because I try to get a really big impact out of it, but of course you have to think about how quickly is the deck moving and how likely is it to be revealed still in H2 and such things when you are thinking about removing a strong H2 leader. In two-player games, it's maybe also a very important event, because in two-player games, oftentimes there will be some big culture production build, and leaders like Bach and Shakespeare are just insanely good. And if you are not the one who has one of those leaders, then having that event in hand and timing it correctly can really save you the game, instead of maybe having 4 or 5 turns in H3 where your opponent has some big Shakespeare production. You can just remove Shakespeare, and that will generate some insane value for you. So in two-player games, it can be quite strong. If you have seeded it, ideally, of course, you want to have a leader for yourself that is not too bad to lose in H3. And as said, most of the times you use the Iconoclasm with the intention to remove an H2 leader in H3. That you intentionally want to remove an H1 leader in H2 happens rather rarely, because and when it will be revealed, most of the times it will already be the end of H2, and then a lot of the players will already have a new leader. So that's happening rather rarely, I would say, but so most of the times you are trying to remove an H3 leader in H2. Sometimes an H3 leader in H4, but we can maybe get to that after talking about the intended use case of, seeding it with the intention of removing H2 leader in H3. Then of course you want to have a leader that is not too bad to lose to it, and leaders that are maybe especially fitting to that are leaders that can maybe nicely be used as transitional leaders. For example, Robespierre. You have Robespierre, you do a Republic Revolution with him, and in an H3 it's not too bad when you lose him. You lose a military action. In case you are low in military action, it can still be painful, but most of the times it will not be that bad, while your opponents probably lose a leader that maybe generates a lot of value. And also a leader like James Watt, if you have finished your coal and selective breeding upgrades, James Watt is just sitting there, unless of course there's an early oil or something, but other than that he might just be sitting there not doing anything, and if then the iconoclasm is revealed, it's just not too bad to lose a leader like James Watt. An interesting leader to think about when thinking about iconoclasm is maybe also Alfred Nobel, because Nobel has a bigger, or not a big, but has a disadvantage in H3, and that is that he doesn't give the civil action back when replacing him, and civil actions in H3 are extremely important and that can be quite painful, but at least that means that maybe losing Nobel is not as bad, as you wouldn't have lost a civil action to replace your leader anyway, while your opponents lose now not only what the leader is giving them, but also the civil action that they would get as soon as they replace the leader. On the other hand, of course, then there are no Nobel prizes. So if you're aiming towards a position where you at the end of H3 want to score a bunch of Nobel prizes, then of course losing Nobel to an iconoclasm can end up being quite bad. Yeah. And then of course, if you keep the iconoclasm a little bit longer in hand, there is sometimes a chance to make it that it is revealed in H4. And yes, and it's maybe a bit difficult when that will be used best, but if, for example, there is a player in last position who wants to build a big Hollywood and has Fleming or Chaplin as a leader, if you somehow manage it to time the iconoclasm so that it is revealed just before that player's last turn and that player loses maybe Chaplin and Fleming, that costs him the culture production and then double the culture production that the leader would give them for the Hollywood. Or maybe Pierre with the internet. Pierre has sometimes will produce a lot of culture if you have maybe 3 or sometimes 4 arenas, and then losing that and the value that Pierre would give on the internet, potentially even the Olympic Games that he would declare at the beginning of his last turn, could also be quite big. Those things are often not that easy to foresee, and oftentimes you maybe can't as easily keep an iconoclasm in hand for that long. Sometimes it will just happen that it will be revealed in H4 because the event deck is moving slowly, or you kept it in hand and you maybe just wanted to push. But sometimes you can also intentionally, if you are seeing that your opponents are building up something in that direction, seed it and hope that it can have quite an impact in H4, especially if you are playing in one of the earlier seeds, so that maybe there is a chance that you still got the value out of the leader, the last production, and then it will be revealed after that. So similar like with the economic progress, just the other way around. You don't really lose anything, but the others still lose something. Of course, you can also still lose something, for example, if you lose Marlene and there's impact of happiness or something. And then the other way around, if you are in the position where you have maybe Fleming and want to build the Hollywood, or maybe you are in a position where you want to declare war, H4 will start and you are relying on Marlene Dietrich, whether the tactic is fulfilled or not, then you maybe should take a look whether iconoclasm is still in the game. And in the scenario where you want to declare war with Marlene, you need to consider, is it really worth the risk that iconoclasm could be revealed, especially if not the most, if maybe a lot of H2 events are already out and iconoclasm is one of the few that you don't have knowledge about. you really have to consider if it's worth potentially maybe losing the war if that event is revealed. And on the other hand, if you are maybe having Flaming and you are at your last turn, want to finish the Hollywood, and there's an H2 event on top, and you have only a mediocre or maybe slightly good impact, then you also need to really consider the position. Do I have maybe already a good position? And if yes, you maybe shouldn't push, because an Iconoclasm could just really cost you a lot of culture. But of course, if you are a bit behind, need some luck, you always have to just seed and hope that it is no Iconoclasm. Alright, so that may be enough about the Iconoclasm. Then let's continue with the Ravages of Time. The Ravages of Time also can be quite impactful, maybe not as impactful as the Iconoclasm. One last thing about the Iconoclasm is, of course, if you have knowledge about it and you are going into H3, of course, you also need to value H3 leaders very, very heavily and try to get one as soon as you can. Ravages of Time also can be quite impactful, but maybe a bit more slowly, because if the leaders are lost, then the impact is a lot more sudden maybe, and then it has a lot of sudden impact, but maybe players will then get a new leader relatively quickly or something, and then the effect is gone again. But of course, for the Ravages of Time, the wonder is gone for the rest of the game, and you can't get a replacement for it. And that event is also interesting in the sense that the existence of that event is already somewhat important when deciding just at the beginning of the game what wonder do you want to go for. I think a wonder like Hanging Gardens would be a lot stronger if Ravages of Time wouldn't exist. And yeah, so there are some wonders that are normally not that bad to lose, where getting the 2 culture protection from the Ancient Ruins can actually sometimes be beneficial. For example, wonders that are maybe not too bad to lose are something like Colossus, especially, or only maybe when it is revealed in H3, because the draws early in H3 are still very valuable, but after that 2 strength, 1 colonization force at that part of the game, maybe not too important, and getting 2 culture production is that quite strong. So if you have the Colossus, it can be a very nice event to see it. With the Library of Alexandria, maybe turning the 1 science into an additional culture production can also be quite fine. If you have enough happy faces, the Stonehenge can maybe be somewhat fine to lose. Then HA wonders where I would be a bit more careful. For the Acropolis, it depends a lot on whether you are maybe already in that H3 government form that you ideally want to get into. If you are, then it's maybe also fine to lose that one, unless you are also still needing the urban building limit. So for that, it depends on the situation. For wonders like Roman roads and pyramids, I normally don't like to see that much, unless of course my opponents have maybe only an H1 wonder, which is even more painful to lose. For sometimes I thought that losing the pyramids to Ravages of Time is quite fine, because you just go from 0 to 2 culture production from the wonder, but with more experience I think that very often the civil action is just too important. Having a lot of civil actions will just allow you to do some additional stuff, will maybe allow you to be in a position where you at your last turn can take and finish a wonder, which sometimes can be important. Maybe you can have enough civil actions to play 2 reserves, take air forces for 3, develop it, increase population 1 time, in order to threaten enough strength. So civil actions are just extremely important. So if you are not having maybe even 8 or 9 civil actions, I would be careful. But if you're having a lot of civil actions, of course losing the pyramids can be fine, and the 2 culture production can be worth more. Rome roads in H3, where Ravages of the Times most of the times will maybe be revealed, or maybe the end of H2 sometimes. Then the Rome roads will produce you 2 culture production. So culture-wise, you're not gaining anything, you're just losing a yellow token and a blue token, and especially the yellow token loss can be quite painful. So losing the Rome roads not something that I like when no, it's just not great having Rome roads and Ravages of Time being revealed. And yeah, then of course the Hanging Gardens, probably the wonder that can be the worst, just because of the sudden impact. You are maybe relying on the happy faces. Ideally, you rely on them to get the most out of the Hanging Gardens, but of course you have to have in mind that Ravages of Time can be possible. You still need to ideally find a way to get the happy faces back if Ravages of Time is revealed, but if you don't have a chance to get them back, or maybe if just at that time you get hit by a wall or need to do some very important thing, then it can just have such a big and sudden impact that can be quite bad. And of course, if your opponent skip the HA Wonder, then most of the times Riches of Time is an event that you really want to push, or that you definitely don't want to push if you are the player who skipped the HA Wonder. I think Universitas losing that one in the later parts of H3 sometimes is fine. Sometimes it's fine to sacrifice this 2 science production to get 1 more culture production, but most of the times losing H1 Wonder to Riches of Time is quite painful. So that is definitely a risk of skipping the HA Wonder. With Universitas, I think it's fine, but if you, for example, build something like Great Wall as your first Wonder, which is especially strong because it has that big late game potential, and then that one gets removed with Ravages of Time, that's just extremely painful, losing maybe 5 or 6 strength in a happy phase. Then we have the Terrorism, which is also, I would say, all of those 3 events here at the beginning can be extremely impactful, but the terrorism may be even more so potentially, because if you end up having the lowest culture, and for example you are playing a 4-player game, being able to destroy a building from each opponent, basically playing something like a raid against each opponent, of course without the benefits for yourself, but still with 1 destruction per opponent, it's just a lot of value. And if I have that in hand and I see that maybe I'm in a position where either I already have the lowest culture, or I'm in a position where when I play it right, I can maybe manage to have the lowest production, maybe on purpose, not going for a lot of culture production, or maybe even having in some extreme cases famine or something, then it can be very worthwhile seeding, and I think it can be worthwhile to also take some risks. Of course, you have to be careful, because when one other player is at the end with the least culture, one of your buildings will get destroyed, but at least then still some buildings from the opponents will get destroyed in a 3 and 4 player game. But yeah, I would not only seed it when you are safe, but also when it's close, because you have the knowledge about it, you can maybe play a little bit around it, and even when the culture is close, sometimes, of course, you have to do some calculations, how the culture production will evolve. Maybe some players have some H1 leaders that are giving them culture for now, but those will be gone soon or something. So it's sometimes a bit difficult to calculate, but if you think that there's at least a chance that if you play it correctly, that you have maybe the lowest culture, even when it's close, I oftentimes take the risk and try to win it at the end. Of course, when you don't have knowledge about the event and you see another player doing some awkward stuff that doesn't make sense, and it seems like he wants to stay low in culture on purpose, it can sometimes, of course, tell you that such an event is coming. Same, I maybe didn't talk about it too much for the other events, of course, for Iconoclasm as well. If you see that another player plays a bit weird, doesn't elect his H2 leader yet, and H3 starts, you have to be, of course, considering that Iconoclasm is coming. Then, whether you are willing to see terrorism and whether you are willing to take a risk in order to see terrorism also, of course, depends on what urban buildings you are having. Maybe you don't have any advanced urban buildings yet. Maybe you have an arena, a bread and circuses arena, maybe 2 labs, maybe you got your additional science production from something like Universitas or maybe Harvard College, and for the moment you don't have any expensive buildings, and there's also not the need to build some of them quickly. In such a situation, it, I think, can be worthwhile to take some risks, seeding that when it's not clear whether you will actually be the player with the lowest culture or not, because even if you are not, the thing that you are losing is not really that bad for you, and still, especially in a multiplayer game, there's still 1 and 2 other opponents who then maybe will lose something more valuable. And sometimes in extreme cases, especially if the player who probably will be the lowest in culture is not a direct contender in the game, or maybe in the tournament standings, you can just seed it with the intent of that player winning it, the buildings that you are having are not too expensive. It's not too bad to lose them, but maybe an opponent has already built a journalism or something, and then you can let the other player destroy that expensive building from the opponent and only lose a cheap building. But when you are aiming towards something like that, you have to be careful that you that it is also fine for you to maybe stay on those low-cost buildings for longer. Because if you have to delay investing into something like journalism or scientific method yourself because you know that soon enough terrorism is revealed, it is just extremely annoying. So now, an extremely impactful event. If you see that you're lost in culture, just put it into the deck. Make sure that it is revealed quickly so that it has still an impact, and then that can really also be a helpful event to maybe get back into the game, especially if you are lost in culture without a lot of compensation, with maybe a bigger economy. It can be a helpful event to help you getting back into the game. Then we have another event. The next event is the National Pride, which is a relatively easy one. That's basically the opposite in some sense of the terrorism. In this case, the player with the most culture is rewarded, but not nearly as much as the players rewarded who has the lowest culture. For the terrorism, you win 5 culture, which is still fine, but it's also not that much. So it's an event that you don't need to play around a lot or something. Of course, it can still be a bit swingy whether you or maybe one of your opponents wins the National Pride, especially in a 2-player game. You have to be a bit careful if the culture situation is close or if you have seeded it and you know that it is coming. Maybe sometimes it can be worthwhile not seeding, getting your culture production, getting ahead of that in again for the event and making sure to win it. So because in 2-player games it's of course always a swing, but in 4-player games I think oftentimes it can be fine to seed a National Pride even as a somewhat neutral event into the deck. Especially if you maybe want to seed an event and you don't have anything, don't stop seeding the National Pride just because it's likely that you don't win it in a 4-player game, because when your alternative is to not seed and you don't get the 2 culture for seeding and potential benefits that you get from seeding. But even if we only take the 2 culture, you are getting 2 culture because you seeded. One opponent will get 5 culture, 2 other opponents will get 0 culture. So in total, it's only a +1 for your opponents. Of course, if that opponent is important, that likely will win it, is important for how the game is going or in the tournament standings. So you're a big contender, you have to be a bit more careful. But in 4-player games, it's a fine event to see. It's similar to Crime Wave, even when you not know where do you have the most culture. When you have the most culture, of course, it's a great event to see it. And if it is in a deck, it can still be worth to maybe play around it to some extent, especially in a 2-player game. But especially in 3 and 4-player games, you can sometimes also just put it into the deck if you want to see it, even if you maybe think that you won't win it. And yeah, it's of course an event that will reward an early game culture strategy, putting you maybe even more ahead in the culture lead and maybe creating a bigger buffer towards the players who will score a lot of culture at the end with maybe some stronger economies going. Alright, let's see which event is still left. Let's maybe go into that overview again. Those we had all already. The popularization of science is left, and I think that's also the last event. So the last event that we are going to take a look at is the popularization of science, which you maybe can call the one impact from H2, because it feels more like an impact from H3 than an H2 event. Players score culture depending on how they have built their civilization, and the more science production they're having, the more culture they are getting. And yeah, of course, when seeding about it, you need to consider, of course, how much culture, science production do the players have at the moment, but also what is the potential. Do you have an easy way to get more science production going? Do your opponents have a way to get more science production going? Are there some leaders left in the deck that your opponents could be getting, like Newton, that could really boost their science production? And is a player very nicely set up to go heavily into computers? So yeah, just can sometimes be a relatively neutral event. It can be an event that you can keep in hand for a bit longer when you are aiming towards building up a strong economy, and then sometimes you maybe manage to go into 2 or 3 computers, and out of the sudden it can actually be something like a very strong impact for you. And then it can potentially be quite strong. Sometimes it will be a neutral event, and maybe not too much to say about it. Just think about if there's the potential for an opponent to boost the science production in the next few turns. You of course need to have that into account. If maybe a player can go for Harvard College or set Newton, or will go for scientific methods soon, and then of course you have to maybe be a bit careful, because it could end up being a big science swing, and also a nice event to catch up in economy when your opponents are running away with the culture. Maybe a player goes for a low science game with Bach and you are building a strong economy, then it's definitely worthwhile keeping that event around, and maybe also not seeding it too early, seeding it later on when maybe it will really create some big value, making sure that it is still revealed in the game, because while it feels like an impact, it of course won't be evaluated after the game, and sometimes if you seed it too late, maybe it won't be revealed any longer. Yeah, so that probably not really a lot more to say about that event. Yeah, and with that, we have done it. We have gone through all of the H2 events apart from the colonies. Let's check one last time that I didn't miss any event. Don't want to feel any event or make it that any event feels left out. But yeah, I think we have gone through all of them. Maybe some general notes about seeding. Of course, I said it a lot when I talked about the event, but you have to consider how likely or how quickly is the event likely revealed. Is the event deck flipped immediately when you seed it, or has the event deck just flipped and you seed it and it takes a longer time? Then it's a lot more difficult to evaluate how an event will perform for you. So the more swingy events you ideally seed when the event deck is about to flip, and the more neutral and safer events you ideally seed when the event deck just flipped, because then it takes a long time potentially until that event could be revealed. If you are at the beginning of H2 and there are still some H1 events in the event deck, then you sometimes have the chance to seed an H2 event. It's also possible the other way around. Maybe some H2 events are seeded already and you have an H1 event. In such situations, because the events from earlier ages are always evaluated first, you can gain some interesting knowledge, because you seed an event and you can very nicely know when it will be revealed. Normally, you know, okay, it could be the first event, it could be the 5th event, the 3rd event of the event deck. I don't know exactly when it will be revealed, but if you seed an H2 event and maybe the deck is just about to flip, there have been, let's say in a 3-player game, 4 H1 events seeded already. You put an H2 event in there, maybe it can be a swingy one, and you know exactly when it will be coming. Of course, you don't know exactly how quickly the other players will seed, but you have a good estimate and you can prepare for that event nicely. So that's something interesting to have in mind. And just always consider, what is the event giving you? What does the event potentially cost you or your opponent? What could it give the opponents? And how much do the opponents need the thing? Not only now, but ideally you can have an estimate in mind how much those things will be worth or damaging some turns in the future when the event will actually be revealed. Not an easy skill to have, but that's why Through the Ages is a very interesting game, and the event mechanic is just something very interesting. Alright, I think with that we are probably at the end of the video. Let's have a quick look at how long we are going already. Oh yeah, it is already quite a long video. I hope it was not boring for you. I hope I didn't talk too much about events. Probably for the more expert players among you, some things were already known. But maybe it's an interesting format where you can maybe also just handle it a little bit like a podcast and just listen to it. So let me know what you think of that kind of video, and of course also let me know your thoughts about the H2 events in the comments. I'm very interested to hear if maybe are some aspects that I forgot to talk about or that I didn't think about myself yet. So I'm interested to hear about that. Also, I think I wanted to mention it at the beginning, but I think I forgot about it. DannyBoy14, who has his own YouTube channel, you can find it linked in the description, has just recently published 2 videos where he talks about using poker skills in Through the Ages. I have to admit that I haven't watched them yet, but I will definitely do so. The videos before were definitely very worthwhile to watch. And yeah, so definitely check out his channel. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I definitely will watch them soon as well myself. And yeah, with that, I say thanks for watching. The next videos that will be coming will be about the Intermezzo Championship. And yeah, until then, have a nice time and see you in the next video.